ever felt a room go cold after one awkward moment, we're comparing Belonging by Geoffrey Cohen and The Courage to be Disliked by Kishimi and Koga to fix that friction. One side argues the issue is belonging uncertainty, and conversely, the other claims it's really about how you choose your response in the moment. Stay to the end, because the real answer is not just about which book sounds wiser. What if most interpersonal friction does not begin with a huge argument at all, but with a tiny feeling that says you do not belong here? Belonging makes that the starting point, and it is a strong starting point because it matches real life better than people often admit. Its core idea is simple. People do not just react to events, they react to how they experience those events. That means the same comment, silence, look, or delay can feel neutral to one person and deeply threatening to another, especially if that person already carries old experiences of rejection, bias, humiliation, or exclusion. That is a very practical idea for you because it explains why some people become defensive over things that seem small. If you walk into a new workplace and nobody greets you, one person may shrug it off while another may feel instantly judged and emotionally shut down. The point Geoffrey L. Cohen makes in Belonging is that the second person is not necessarily overreacting. They may be reading the room through a history that the room cannot see. Here is where we often go wrong. We assume every tense person is simply too sensitive, so we respond with cold logic, impatience, or mockery. The result is predictable. They feel even less safe, they withdraw further, and the friction gets worse because now they are not only dealing with the original slight, but also with your dismissal of their experience. The right way to handle this is to notice that belonging is fragile. You make the situation warmer before you demand better behavior. You greet the person, name the shared purpose, acknowledge their contribution, and remove the feeling that they are alone in the room. The result is often that they stop bracing for an attack and become far easier to talk to. That is where belonging becomes especially useful. It is not telling you to become soft or naive. It is telling you that a lot of conflict is actually a signal problem. People think the situation is saying, you are not accepted, even when nobody has said those words out loud. Now the courage to be disliked comes in and asks a harder question. What if the main problem is not the event itself, but what you choose to do with it? That book rejects the idea that your present life is mainly controlled by past causes, and it pushes a teleological view instead. People move toward goals, even when they are not fully aware of those goals. That is a very different frame. Under this view, interpersonal friction is not just something that happens to you. It is often something you participate in because it serves a purpose. Sometimes that purpose is obvious, like forcing attention, winning control, or avoiding vulnerability. Sometimes it is hidden, like keeping your distance so you never have to risk rejection. The courage to be disliked is ruthless in a useful way. It says that anger can be used as a tool, not just as a spontaneous eruption. It also says people often keep the self they have because the known self feels safer than the unknown self. So when you are stuck in friction, the question is not only what happened to you, but also what are you getting from staying stuck? That can be uncomfortable, but it is powerful. If you are always in conflict with co-workers, friends, or family, the courage to be disliked forces you to look at your own pattern. Are you escalating because you want respect? Are you keeping distance because closeness feels risky? Are you acting wounded because being wounded protects you from responsibility? The wrong way to use this book is to become harsh and accusatory. If you tell someone you chose this conflict without tact, you will make them defensive and destroy trust. The right way is more disciplined. You use the idea to take responsibility for your part, regulate your emotions, and stop treating your feelings as absolute commands. In other words, the courage to be disliked does not ask you to deny pain. It asks you not to hand pain the steering wheel. That is a major difference. This is where the real fight begins. Belonging says friction often grows because people feel unseen, socially unsafe, or uncertain that they are wanted. The courage to be disliked says friction often grows because people are choosing a strategy, even unconsciously, that keeps them from changing. Those are not the same explanation, and they lead to different interventions. If you use only the belonging lens, you may become very good at creating safety, but too forgiving of a person who keeps repeating the same manipulative pattern. If you use only the courage to be disliked lens, you may become very good at demanding responsibility, but blind to the fact that some people truly are entering the room already braced for humiliation. That is why the title question matters. When you have interpersonal friction, what actually works better? Reassurance first or accountability first? The answer depends on the situation, and both books help, but they help in different ways. Imagine you are in a team meeting. One person says almost nothing, then suddenly reacts sharply when their work is questioned. Belonging would ask whether they felt ignored long before they snapped. Maybe nobody credited their effort. Maybe they already feel like an outsider. The courage to be disliked would ask whether that sharp reaction is also serving a purpose. Maybe anger lets that person seize the room without having to say, "I feel exposed." Maybe silence gives them protection and the outburst gives them control. Both can be true at once. That is the most honest conclusion. People can be hurt and still use their hurt strategically. Let us make this real. You send a message to a friend, co-worker, or teammate, and they reply in a clipped, irritated way. The wrong move is to instantly decide they are hostile and answer with equal coldness. That usually escalates the friction because now the other person feels justified in being defensive. Belonging would suggest a better first move. Lower the threat level. You clarify intent, show warmth, and reduce the chance that they are reading your message as rejection. If the problem was a fragile sense of belonging, this can restore the connection fast. But now consider the other version. You keep bending over backward for the same person over and over, and they keep using irritation to dominate the exchange. In that case, the courage to be disliked would say, you may be enabling a goal-driven pattern. You need firmer boundaries, clearer speech, and less emotional overreaction on your part. Here is what the right blend looks like. You respond with warmth, but you do not surrender your center. You say, in effect, that came across as tense, and I want to understand it, but I also need the conversation to stay respectful. That line does two things at once. It supports belonging and blocks manipulation. That is why a rational hybrid approach is so strong. Belonging helps you prevent unnecessary wound-making. The courage to be disliked helps you stop rewarding dysfunctional behavior. Together they give you both softness and spine. Belonging is best when friction comes from uncertainty, exclusion, or atmosphere. If someone feels like the outsider in the room, if a workplace feels cold, if a newcomer is reading silence as rejection, or if a past wound is making a present interaction feel dangerous, belonging gives you the right lens. Its practical strength is that it teaches you to become a better host. You do not wait for people to prove they belong before you make them feel welcome. You create the conditions that let them breathe, speak, and relax. That is especially useful in groups, classrooms, onboarding situations, and any environment where status is unclear. The courage to be disliked is best when friction comes from habit, resistance, and avoidance. If the same person keeps exploding, withdrawing, boasting, or blaming, the courage to be disliked stops you from getting hypnotized by excuses. It pushes you to ask what goal the behavior serves and what lifestyle the person is protecting. Its practical strength is that it restores agency. You are not a puppet of the past, and you do not need to build your identity around being injured. That is a strong message for anyone who has let old frustration become a permanent way of living. The limitation of belonging is that it can explain too much and excuse too much if used badly. The limitation of the courage to be disliked is that it can become emotionally blind if used badly. One sees the wound but may underplay responsibility. The other sees responsibility but may underplay the wound. Now comes the part that matters most. If you are the one dealing with interpersonal friction, which book should you actually use in the moment? The answer is not philosophical elegance. It is practical timing. If the person across from you looks guarded, withdrawn, or quietly tense, start with belonging. That means calm tone, clear intent, and signals that they are not being shoved out of the group. If you skip that and go straight to correction, you may create the very resistance you were trying to remove. However, if the person across from you is using tension as a weapon, or using emotional display to dodge accountability, start with the courage to be disliked. That means do not panic, do not over-apologize, and do not let their mood define the whole interaction. Ask the direct question, name the issue, and keep your behavior steady. A useful example is a co-worker who says, "Nobody ever respects me here," after a minor disagreement. The belonging lens tells you to check whether they feel chronically unseen. The courage to be disliked lens tells you to check whether this claim is also a strategy to seize moral ground and avoid being challenged. The wrong move is choosing one lens forever. Real life is messier than that. Some people need reassurance before they can hear the truth. Some people need truth before they can stop using reassurance as a shield. So which book wins the battle over interpersonal friction? The honest answer is that belonging is stronger at explaining the feeling of friction, while the courage to be disliked is stronger at explaining the behavior that keeps friction alive. If the problem is that people feel unseen, unsafe, or out of place, belonging is more practical first. If the problem is that people keep choosing the same defensive pattern, the courage to be disliked is more practical first. The smartest approach is usually a hybrid. Make the room safer, then demand clearer responsibility. That is the most rational conclusion. Do not treat people like machines with no wounds, and do not treat wounds like excuses with no agency. When you combine warmth with accountability, you get the best chance of turning friction into actual understanding. And in a world full of people silently wondering whether they belong, that combination is not just wise. It is the difference between a conversation that dies in tension and a conversation that finally opens.